Hello and welcome to Hammer Time, a Hammer horror podcast, part of the Evolution of Horror Network. I'm Becky Darke, a film critic and Hammer fangirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, human encyclopedia of film and TV, and Hammer superfan Kevin Lyons. Hi Kev, how are you?
Hello Becky, how are you? This is unusual. We're doing this one and we can see each other, which is unusual because normally we switch the cameras off so that you don't have to look at my face and I don't have to put up with you looking at my face. So
it's nice to see your face, Kev.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, only because you like horror films, but there you go.
In this podcast, Kevin and I are usually watching and discussing every horror film in Hammer's back catalogue. But this week, we've got something a little different for you. We are delighted to be joined by writer and Hammer historian Marcus Hearn, author of numerous books about Hammer, including The Hammer Story, which has a third edition coming out soon, and director of the brand new documentary Hammer and Beyond, the Jimmy Sangster Legacy, which Kev and I appear in, excitingly.
We do, don't we? Yes.
So a huge welcome to Marcus Hearn. Marcus Hearn, thank you so much for joining Kev and I on Hammer Time. This has been a long time coming, actually, getting you on to talk to us about Jimmy Sangster. So welcome.
Well, I'm a big fan, so it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So let's learn a little bit about you first. Can you give us a quick intro, Marcus, kind of about who you are, what you do, and what's your history with Hammer?
Well, gosh, that's a big question.
It's a big question.
I'm an author, I'm a journalist, I'm a publisher, and my history with Hammer goes back a long way. It goes back to 1994. When I was an editor for Marvel Comics, working on Doctor Who magazine, actually. But my editorial director was a lovely guy called Paul Neary, who was, he was the head of department. He was something of a sort of mentor figure to me. But he had worked in the 1970s for an editor called Des Skin, because Paul, in the early stages of Paul's career, he had been an inker on a comic magazine called House of Hammer. And then in the 90s, I'm not sure how this happened. Either Hammer floated the idea or Marvel floated the idea, I'm not sure, of actually reviving, not reviving House of Hammer, but creating a new Hammer magazine, sort of in the style of Doctor Who magazine. And so he began negotiations with Roy Skeggs, who ran Hammer at that time, and then he basically came into our department and asking who would like to edit the magazine. Yeah. And I was selected. I mean, I'm not entirely sure why I was selected, because I didn't particularly have a great knowledge of Hammer. I'd seen lots of Hammer films. I was a big Quatermass fan, big Dracula fan, but I was not an expert by any means. Yeah. And so I was sent along to Elstree Studios to meet Roy Skeggs, and we got on very well. And to try to cut a long story short, I was given this magazine to edit, which we ran the magazine from 1994 into 1995, which was when Marvel closed its magazine department effectively. And but my association with Hammer didn't end there, because I then went to Titan, where, together with Alan Barnes, who had been my deputy editor on the Hammer magazine, we wrote a book called The Hammer Story.
Amazing.
In 1996, which was the first edition of that. And then one thing led to another, and I was asked to write sleeve notes for home entertainment releases, which in those days, of course, were on VHS. And then I got asked to do commentaries on Laserdiscs.
Laserdiscs.
Laserdiscs. I did my first commentaries on Laserdiscs. If you can believe it, with Nigel Neal of Val Guest and Christopher Lee and people like that. And I've just been hanging around ever since, really. I suppose I did sort of feel, when I met Roy Skeggs, when I first started working with Hammer in the mid-1990s, I mean, we could do a whole edition just about what Hammer was like at Elstree in those days, because I'm very nostalgic about it. But it really was, the whole organisation was in quite a sort of sorry state, really. There was nobody left at Elstree except, there were only 3 companies left at Elstree at that stage. There was Hammer, there was the Children's Film Foundation, and a producer called, I think, Brian True May, who then went on to do Midsummer Murders. They were the only three companies left at Hammer, and Elstree was under threat of demolition at that point, and Roy and the other guys who were Elstree at that point were basically hanging on because they thought it was an outrage that this great institution was going to be destroyed to make way for a supermarket.
Yeah,
I think quite a lot of it had given way to Tesco's already, I think, at that stage. And so it was all in quite a sort of sorry state, really. And I suppose that was the point, probably, around 1994, around 95, that I started to feel a little bit sort of proprietorial about it. Now, I had no right to feel proprietorial about it, I hasten to add. But nevertheless, I just thought it was shocking that it had been allowed to sort of decline in that way. Yeah. And I kind of admired Roy just for sort of hanging in there, really, because he hung in there for years. And just trying to defend Hammer from people who wants to take it over, and the people that wants to bulldoze Elstree Studios. And they were kind of wilderness years for Hammer, really. But that's when I sort of fell in love with the company, really. And like I said, rightly or wrongly, started to feel a little bit proprietorial about its sort of legacy, really. And I thought, well, what can we do to actually celebrate this company?
Yeah.
And so I've been hanging around ever since.
Well, and you've been celebrating them for years now, Marcus. You write books and you make documentaries. I mean, that's one of the reasons. The main reason, really, we're sort of having this chat today is your new documentary in the Sangster Directs Hammer box set, which is this beautiful box set, which has just been released by Severin Films. So it's collected together basically the three Hammer films directed by Jimmy Sangster: Horror of Frankenstein, Lust for a Vampire, and Fear in the Night. And you've directed a sort of extra feature, really, which is this very comprehensive documentary about the man himself, lots of talking heads. And Kevin and I were very grateful and delighted to be asked to come and be a part of that. I've since my box set has actually arrived now. I've got it in my hands. It is stunning. And I've had the pleasure now of actually watching the documentary, and it's really good. And I learned things. It's so funny when you're kind of a part of something and then you sort of watch it or read it afterwards and you think, my God, I'm learning so much from this thing that I had any sort of idea of sort of being part of in this tiny little way. But we're here to talk about Jimmy Sangster. And Kev, you and I have mentioned Sangster so many times with such praise over the last few months that we've been doing the podcast.
Yeah.
But I wondered if you could just sort of give us a bit of a headline, as you often do at the tops of our episodes, of kind of, let's have a look at who Jimmy Sangster was, sort of from your perspective, and in terms of both his work sort of with Hammer and slightly beyond. Just give us a bit of a sort of overview.
Well, from my perspective, I'd say he was one of the most important figures in the whole of Hammer's history, to be honest. He was the guy who wrote the script for The Curse of Frankenstein, and so that kick-started the whole Hammer Gothic. Yes, of course, they were directed by Terence Fisher. They were scored and, production designed and produced by others. But without Sangster's script, none of that would have mattered very much. And he went on to do Dracula, Revenge of Frankenstein, The Man Who Could Cheat Death, The Mummy. So he was there right at the very start of the birth of Hammer Gothics. He very quickly sort of got a bit tired of doing them, I think. I think he sort of worried about being typecast, as it were, as a Gothic horror writer. And so he pitched an idea, let's do a psychological horror film. And he was thinking, I think, more along the lines of the French director, Clouseau. And he's, sort of mini Clouseaus. James Carreras, who was the managing director at Hammer, he was canny enough to know that most of the public would have no idea who Clouseau was. And so he dubbed them mini Hitchcocks. Not quite correct, but it did the trick. It did the trick. So there's Sangster now, sort of with a whole new wave of horror films for Hammer, kind of reinventing himself a bit and giving Hammer a real boost at that point, I think. And then we have this third phase of his career, which is celebrated in this box set, where he comes back to them as a director. We shall talk more about that when we get to the films and the episodes. But I think I've already trailed the fact that I'm going to be a little bit grumpy when I get to talk about those films. But I mean, you know, as you said, the box set is stunning. Mine arrived yesterday too, and it is an absolutely gorgeous set. And if we're going to celebrate those films, and at least one of them we should, then this is the perfect way to do it, I think.
Yeah, and I should say, actually, you know, we're not getting paid to do this episode. We've got Kev and I have been very lucky to get our hands on this box set because we've got contributors' copies. But it just seemed like the perfect opportunity with it coming out to get Marcus on. And as I say, we talk about Sangster so much over so many of our episodes, and it felt like a good way to a good opportunity to sort of dive a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
Marcus, you have you're on record, I think, as with similar sentiments as Kev in terms of Jimmy Sangster being one of the absolute sort of most influential and important people in the history of Hammer. Why was it important for you to make this documentary specifically?
Well, it was important to me for several reasons. Firstly, because as we pointed out, Jimmy was one of the most important people in Hammer's history. He was one of the chief architects of Gothic horror, of the Gothic horror strand, and then he was the chief architect, I think, of the strand of psychological thrillers that he subsequently initiated, and so he was one of the most important people in Hammer's history. But even then, he's underrated. And that's why I wanted to make this program, really, because I wanted to make the point that even though he is justifiably celebrated for all the things he did a lot more than he's ever really been given credit for. Because I think he was responsible for really creatively steering the company at key points in its history in the 1950s, in the early 1960s. And again, in the early 1970s, it's almost as though he could see the shape of the course that they had to navigate through horror filmmaking for a good 15 or so years. He made it happen in the beginning. He changed its course somewhere around the middle. He tried to change its course again in the late 60s, which is something that we address in the documentary. And he was there to bring it to an end. Mm-hmm. In the 1970s. And I don't think he's given credit for that. And so I wanted us to celebrate that. I wanted to celebrate his versatility as well. But also there's a sort of personal angle for me as well, really, because I knew Jimmy very well. And I met Jimmy, in fact, I met Jimmy when he came to the offices of Marvel Comics in 1995. That was the first time I met him. And I subsequently became friends with him and his wife, Mary Peach. And I interviewed Jimmy for numerous DVD special features. And we did lots of commentaries together on the Pirates of Blood River and Terror of the Tongs and X the Unknown and so on. And then in 2001, I published his book, Inside Hammer. And then 2 years later, he wrote another book for me called Screenwriting Techniques for Success. Oh, wow. I interviewed him at the National Film Theatre in, I think, 2008. And then I spoke at his funeral in 2011. And I remained very friendly with his wife, Mary, who sadly passed away last year. But from a personal point of view, even though I knew him very well, it was only after he passed away that I think, fully understood how important he was. And it was very difficult to have a conversation with Jimmy about his influence, let alone his talent, because he was so incredibly self-effacing.
Yeah.
And so this documentary is really me and everyone else who's involved in it, asking the questions about Jimmy that I wish I'd asked him when he was still with us.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think because he was so incredibly self-effacing, so modest, I think he, in a way, almost did damage to his own reputation. Really.
Yeah.
I don't think he had the reputation he deserved simply because he was so self-effacing about his work. And so from that aspect, I think we've all made a program that in one very important aspect would have been impossible to make while Jimmy was alive.
There's a lot of really lovely archive footage of Jimmy in the documentary. Is that, have you pulled that from interviews that you had done with him in the past, Marcus?
Some of it is. Some of it is from video interviews that I conducted with Jimmy in 2003. There's also lots of audio in there, and that's all from interviews and commentaries, the numerous interviews and commentaries, audio commentaries I did with Jimmy over the years. There is also footage from the British Entertainment History Project in there as well. There's also an interview that was conducted by Donald Fearney and Jim Groom at Bray Studios as well. And so there's an awful lot of stuff in there. There's also a lot in there from Jimmy's own collection, from Jimmy's own archive. You're going to see, anyone who watches the documentary is going to see a lot of stuff that I think hasn't been seen before. Stills and scripts and things that actually came from Jimmy's collection, which I inherited after he died.
Amazing. Some of my favourite bits are where he's kind of looking through photos of him on set of, you know, the films that he was producing and directing with the stars of the films, but also so much earlier when he was sort of much more behind the camera as a very young man. And it's really lovely to kind of see those behind the scenes pictures, but also see them kind of see him remembering as he looks at them.
Yeah, he was a very self-effacing guy, but I think there's also an element that his career was so rich and so lengthy that I think he genuinely could not remember everything he'd actually done.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, there's a story that he used to love telling, which was when he moved to Los Angeles in the early 1970s. He was attending a party somewhere, and he met some guy who was a producer at one of the studios, and the guy asked him who he was, and he said, "Oh, my name's Jimmy Sangster. I've just come over from England to where I've been making films. I'm a writer. I've been writing films." And the guy looked at him, the American guy looked at him kind of in a quite sort of cynical way and said, "Oh yeah. So how many films have you written then, Jimmy?" And Jimmy said, 40, like that. Right, okay. And how many were actually produced? And Jimmy looked at him and said, 40. I mean, he wrote, I mean, for Hammer alone, to say nothing of the work he did for Tempian or other producers. I mean, for Hammer alone, I think he wrote 23 films, and this doesn't include the ones that he wrote for Hammer that weren't produced. It doesn't even include this is not to even mention the fact that he wrote a storyline for Satanic Rites of Dracula, or that he wrote a film for Hammer called The Bride of Newgate Jail, which we discuss in the documentary, which was never produced, or that he wrote a film for him called The Fairy Tale Man, which he described as the best screenplay he ever wrote, which Hammer weren't able to produce, but he did actually produce for Disney in 1980 under a different title. So there were 23 that actually made it to the screen just for Hammer alone. And so I think his career was so rich and so varied that, yes, he was a very self-effacing man. He was a very modest man. But I think there was also an element that, given that he was working in the era before VHS even, that he couldn't actually remember everything he'd done. You needed to remind him.
Yeah. And Kev, he was able to... he was such a versatile writer. You know, he was able to do the gothics. He was able to do the kind of psychological horrors. And then, you know, he moved to America. He was writing for TV. He's able to write mysteries. He's able to write a TV episode, or he's able to write, you know, a sort of hour and 45-minute film. I mean, there's just such versatility in him. Do you think that there's something quite unique about that specifically with Jimmy Sangster, that he was never kind of able to kind of just stick with one thing? He always seemed to be looking at, you know, what's next? What can I do, you know, to sort of to keep doing new things?
Well, Marcus would be able to answer better, I guess, but my perception of Jimmy Sangster was that he wasn't a man willing to sit still for very long, that he would do something, he would, invent the modern British Gothic horror film in the late 1950s and then kind of think, well, I've done that. Why do I need to keep doing this? Because he was making Gothic horror films or writing Gothic horror films for other companies as well, as Marcus suggested. It wasn't just Hammer. And I think he thought, well, I've done it. Why do I want to keep repeating myself? And so he went to do the psychological horrors. And that happened as well in Hollywood, I think, when he got to Hollywood. And he was able to do a lot more, I think, in Hollywood than he was in Britain. I think in Britain he was becoming, or in danger of becoming, typecast as the horror man. Whereas in America, he could be much more of a mystery writer, a thriller writer, a whatever he wanted to be writer. But, I think I just get the impression he never liked sitting still for very long. He wanted to keep moving, wanted to keep trying something new. Marcus, would that be fair?
I think he was definitely a restless spirit. But this, of course, is what helped to initiate the Gothic horror films in the first place. The fact that he was, to use a modern parlance, he was the guy who thought outside the box. Because The Curse of Frankenstein is a film of startling originality and invention.
Yeah.
It really is. And the way he then reinvents Dracula.
Yeah.
Subsequently. And then The Revenge of Frankenstein, which is such a witty film, as well as being a very nasty film as well.
So nasty.
But he was a very funny writer, wasn't he?
Oh, yes, absolutely. He was a witty writer, yeah. And he was very finely tuned to, I think, again, what we'd now call the zeitgeist. He's very finely tuned to the angry young man kitchen sink movement of the 1950s, and also very finely tuned to that sort of playful cynicism, which I think really comes to the fore when Dr. No is released. The idea that the Bond films, that you could combine violence with humour. I mean, he's kind of getting there before that, really, with The Revenge of Frankenstein, where it's actually combining cannibalism with a wry sort of arch humour. He's always thinking about trying to do something in a different way. And this is, of course, what made him such a valuable asset to Hammer. Whether Hammer realised how valuable he was to them, I don't know. But in the documentary, John Logan, the great screenwriter John Logan, talks about how Jimmy's molecules, as he says, jumped very quickly to other types of filmmaking. Having initiated the Gothic horror cycle, his molecules then jumped very quickly to mystery, to thrillers, to other types of films, in a way that Anthony Hines and Terence Fisher couldn't or didn't want to, which is nothing against Anthony Hines and Terence Fisher, both of whom are just fantastic and also terribly, terribly important to Hammer, and also, amongst that group of architects of the Hammer style. But I think Jimmy, along with his very good friend Michael Carreras, who was an executive producer at Hammer at the time, recognised that if Hammer stayed within that style, then they would not be able to sustain their success. And he was right, because he actually wrote his first draft of Taste of Fear, his great thriller film, actually before Psycho came out. And you could argue that the release of Psycho really marks the end of Hammer's imperial phase.
Yeah. The
end of its dominance of horror. Hammer ceased to be market leaders, ceased to be pioneers. They're still making great films and films that we love, and they will continue to do it for a long time. But they ceased to be market leaders and pioneers as soon as Hitchcock effectively invents the slasher film.
Yeah.
Which is what he does with Psycho. But, Jimmy has anticipated that. He's already written Taste of Fear. He's already telling Hammer, you've got to change direction, even before Taste of Fear has come out. And he has the foresight to tell Hammer that they've got to change direction again in the late 1960s, which is not something they were able to do, unfortunately. And then he comes back right at the end to actually direct a film called The Horror of Frankenstein, which is essentially a comedy. To wrap the whole thing up, because as far as he's concerned, it's run its course. And what do you know? He's right, because, the traditional Hammer horrors, as we know, they really are over by 1972. And so he was a man of incredible foresight, a man of incredible vision. He wasn't the sort of guy who would articulate that when you actually spoke to him and you actually met him, because he was so self-effacing. And one of the problems I had, actually, I think I mentioned earlier that you wrote a book, which I published in 2003 called Screenwriting Techniques for Success. And I sat down with him, before he started writing the book. We had a number of meetings while he was writing the book. And it soon became quite clear to me that even though he had written so many screenplays and had such a stellar career, it wasn't entirely clear to him how he actually did it.
Yeah.
which became a bit of a problem when he was writing the book. I mean, we got there. His ideas were very simple, but they were very effective. But it seemed to me that this wasn't the case of him having forgotten how he'd done it. It was simply a case that he was, I think, working on a largely instinctual level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing. It almost doesn't surprise me that he wasn't able to put his finger on it, because I think almost that is, the word sort of genius is thrown around a lot, but there's something about people who just have an innate ability for something. And you say, oh, well, how do you come up with your ideas? How, what's your process? How do you do it? And actually, it's extremely difficult to articulate that if it is just so innate to you.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I'm going to name drop here, but Nigel Neal once said to me, he said, the most, as we were having lunch together, he said, the most annoying question, he said, to any journalist can ever ask you, he said, is, where do you get your ideas from?
Right.
And I said, oh, okay. I said, so what do you say when people ask you that? Oh, he said, anytime anyone says to me, where'd you get your ideas from? I always look over my shoulder and say, oh, I get them from that shelf over there as far as keep them. Because there's no sensible answer to that question.
That's such a Nigel Neal thing to say.
Indeed, yeah. But as you were saying earlier, Kev, it wasn't just that that Jimmy knew how to remake, or how to reimagine rather, Frankenstein, because Hammer's Frankenstein is not a remake.
No.
And it's not just that he knew how to reimagine Dracula, because Hammer's Dracula, Jimmy's Dracula, is also not a remake. It's almost that he knew how to pull this trick off over and over again. And he may not have done it in ways that we as Hammer fans always like. I mean, I talked about how at the end of the cycle he came back, not necessarily because Hammer pleaded with him to come back in 1970 and direct the horror of Frankenstein. And it's a controversial film. It's a divisive film. It's a film that many Hammer fans don't like. And I think in the documentary, I think Sir Christopher Frayling, I think, points out that Jimmy didn't come back to necessarily celebrate Hammer. He came back to bury them. Because actually he thought it was over. But if you look at what was happening in the context of filmmaking at that time and how filmmaking was changing at that time, to turn Frankenstein into a slightly bawdy comedy, send the whole thing up, actually was at that time to Jimmy an entirely logical thing to do.
Yeah,
because that's how film was changing. I remember going to see him very shortly before he died, and he wasn't very well, but he was keeping himself amused by reading. And I said to him, "What are you reading?" And he showed me he was reading Easy Rider's Raging Bulls.
Oh, amazing! And
he said to me, "This book's fascinating," he said, because I was there. He said, I was there at Hollywood in this period, when the studio system was collapsing and the independents were on the rise, and we all thought that it was going to be the dawn of a new era of filmmaking, and in many respects it was. But I didn't fully understand what was going on around me, and this book is just absolutely fascinating. He said, telling me everything I didn't know about Los Angeles, about the town I was actually working in at that time.
Yeah.
And he may not have been aware of absolutely everything that was happening. He may not have been fully aware that Warner Brothers was had basically come to an end, and that the 1970s would be such a different decade. But no, I think he was aware of it, certainly on the level where he knew that the traditional Hammer horrors were over and it was time to do something else, because he was very finely tuned to what was happening in film and in theatre as well, I think, to a degree. I think in a way that maybe some of the other people at Hammer weren't, which, as I said earlier, is not to downplay what they did, because they're fantastic. But I think Jimmy and his very good friend, Michael Carreras, were acutely aware of the way cinema was changing. I don't want to change the subject here, really, but I mean, people talk a lot about how Hammer sadly went under Michael Carreras was the managing director, but it absolutely was not because Michael didn't understand what was happening to film at the time, or didn't understand the way horror films were changing. He had an acute awareness of the way things were changing. He just couldn't change Hammer.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for the want of trying. And I think the difference between Michael and Jimmy was that I think Michael had a commitment to Hammer because of the family connection and his loyalty to the company. I think Jimmy was of the view that it was over, it was done, it was time to move on to new things, which he could do.
Yeah.
And Michael couldn't.
Yeah, of course. Kev, we've talked a lot about kind of Jimmy Sangster as a writer, his shaping of the Hammer Gothics and kind of therefore the company, his psychological thrillers and kind of beyond that. I want to ask you briefly about him as a director. And I know that he had said himself, there's a clip of him in Marcus's documentary where Jimmy Sangster actually says about himself, I'm not sure that I was ever really made to be a director, but the opportunities sort of came up, or he even sort of bargained at one point, like, I'll come back if you let me direct it. I think that was Horror of Frankenstein. And I know that not only are the films that he directed maybe not some of the most successful in terms of the wider Hammer fandom, but I know that they're not your favourites either. So how do you kind of reckon his directing abilities with obviously your huge esteem for the man and his kind of writing abilities?
It is difficult because I'm such a huge admirer of Jimmy Sangster, the writer. I mean, just such a huge fan of him as a writer. But as a director, he made a really good writer. And he, I don't know, it's kind of... I wonder if maybe he would have been better if he'd directed somebody else's script. Maybe he was a little too close to some of it. Horror of Frankenstein and Lustre of Vampire are, as we are going to find out from the vantage point of, recording this, two of my least favourite Hammer films. But I quite like Fear in the Night.
Yeah.
His return to the psychological horrors, which I think he was much better suited at as a director to make a psychological horror film than a gothic horror film. I don't know quite what was missing with Horror of Frankenstein and Lustre of Vampire. We'll talk about that when we get there. I'm sure I'll have figured it out by then. But there's just something not quite right with the direction of those films, I find. Whereas Fear in the Night, I buy into it straight away from the start, and I'm with it to the very end.
There's something very interesting about Hammer's last two Frankenstein films. The last two Frankenstein films are, of course, The Horror of Frankenstein, and then in 1972 they make Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Now, I don't much like Horror of Frankenstein. And Jimmy was the first to admit that although he had a fantastic time making it, it's not one of his favourite films either. Now, I really like Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell.
Oh, yes, definitely.
However, do you not think that maybe Horror of Frankenstein is the film they ought to have been making, given everything I've just said, and Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell is the film they probably shouldn't have made?
It's more of a throwback, I think.
And it didn't do any business.
It did no business at all, did it? No. And, the whole horror landscape had changed by the time Monster from Hell comes out. People the public, I think, were sort of, what, another Hammer film, another Gothic film? We've seen so many of those. Why do we need to go and see another one?
But it's an interesting thing, isn't it? So now we look at it from the perspective of 54, 55 years or whatever, and we can compare the films because they sit side by side on our Blu-ray shelf.
Yeah.
And we know that we like watching Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. We know that we don't really appreciate what Jimmy was trying to do with Horror Frankenstein, but there is possibly, I'm playing devil's advocate here, it's possibly more important to fail doing something interesting.
Possibly, yeah.
Than it is to succeed with the film that people didn't want.
This is literally the point that I was just about to make, Marcus. I think we review and talk about so many new horror films, either on Evolution of Horror or on our Fresh Blood podcast. And one of the sort of criticisms, in air quotes, that comes up time and again is, at least it isn't boring.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
This idea that even if you don't necessarily enjoy a film or you don't think that it succeeds, there is a respect for a filmmaker who is at least taking a swing for the fences. And
sure,
I think that,
sure.
and again, Kev, we will get to this conversation / punch up when we get to the Horror of Frankenstein episode. I don't hate it. I mean, it's not great, but like I don't hate it the way, or I don't dislike it the way that a lot of Hammer fans do. And I wonder if that is because I have come into it as part of this kind of slightly virginal journey that I'm going on with all of these films. But I do think that there is something about it. And I think that he's doing it with all of the films that he directs to certain degrees, where he comes in with a vision of, okay, like, I don't want to just do the same thing again, like he does time and time again with his writing. And at least he's trying something different. Doesn't always succeed, but I kind of respect that, even if you don't necessarily enjoy the movie itself.
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem with it is that it's not Young Frankenstein.
Right.
No. Yeah, which came along a few years later. It's a sex comedy that probably isn't sexy enough. And
isn't really funny enough.
Isn't funny enough.
Yeah.
You know. But nevertheless, I think that he at least recognised that you had to do something different. I mean, to go off on a little detour now. I mean, I listened to what you were saying about Mummy's Shroud recently. And of course, Mummy's Shroud represents the end of an era because it's the last film that's entirely shot of Bray. And many fans are very nostalgic about Bray and revere Bray Studios, quite rightly. Mm-hmm. But The Mummy's Shroud is a film that illustrates, I think, exactly why they couldn't keep working at Bray. Because you look at The Mummy's Shroud and you see that the facility was clearly inadequate.
Yeah.
To make a film of that ambition.
Yeah.
And that scale. And I think that sometimes there is a tendency for some fans to sort of regard Hammer as the National Trust of horror. And the National Trust is a wonderful organisation, and we all enjoy going to National Trust houses. But the thing about National Trust houses is that you're not allowed to touch anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're not allowed.
They're like in amber,
to move the furniture,
aren't they? Yeah.
Exactly. Don't move the furniture. Well, here comes Jimmy in 1970. He's moving the furniture.
He's playing
just
musical
as he moves
chairs.
The furniture. Yeah, just as he moves the furniture in 1956 when he wrote Curse of Frankenstein. He moved the furniture again with Taste of Fear in 1960. Yeah. He's the guy that will move the furniture.
And I think it's quite impressive, isn't it? You talked about in 1956 that back then he'd barely written anything at all.
I was going to say, so Hammer took a bit of a chance on him, didn't they?
They did. He'd written a script for a short film for them called The Man on the Beach in 1955. And then there were brainstorming ideas for a follow-up to the Quatermass experiment. We talked about this in this episode. Michael Carreras, Anthony Hines and Jimmy Sangster. And Jimmy came up with this idea. We've done monsters from outer space. Let's do monsters from inner space. And the two producers said, all right, then go and write it. And he did. And it was X the Unknown. And it's terrific. And that was the sort of beginning of his writing career, really. Up until that point, he'd been a production manager, an assistant director, production assistant, you name it, he'd done it all over the place. But he wasn't primarily a writer, was he, Marcus, when he first started in
No, he
career?
wasn't. But he had spent the best part of, I think 10 years on film sets.
Yeah.
And he watched, I remember one of the only time I can remember annoying him or falling out with him about anything was when I interviewed him once about, I think it was about Horror of Frankenstein, actually. And I said to him, you'd never directed before, had you? You'd written lots of films, but you'd never directed before. I said, were you nervous about being a first-time director? And he looked at me and said, no. And I said to him, well, I was being quite light-hearted. I said, so were you winging it? And he looked at me and said, winging it? Winging it? He said, I've been on film sets, he said, for 30 years.
Yeah.
He said, was it winging it? I mean, those aren't the exact words he used, but I'm giving you the family-friendly version there. And I guess, which certainly put me in my place, and quite rightly, I hasten to add. But I guess in the 1940s, that was when he was learning, watching other people and learning. And of course, as you say, Kev, he had that fantastic experience as a production manager. So Hammer, who are the writers that Hammer rely on for so many of their horror films? It's John Elder, or Anthony Hines, aka John Elder, and Jimmy Sangster.
That's right.
It's no coincidence that they're two guys who know how to balance the budget.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Because one of them's got an office at Bro Studios, and he's in charge of the budget, effectively. And Jimmy was his production manager, so he knew exactly what things cost.
I love it in the documentary, the clip of Jimmy Sangster saying, I never wrote a scene that I knew you wouldn't be able to shoot. He had such a filmmaker's or film set brain where even when he's writing stuff, he's always thinking about being on set and actually shooting what he is writing.
Yeah. And I think once you combine that sensibility with such an inventive mind and an awareness of the zeitgeist in the mid-1950s and again at the end of the 1960s, then it made him unstoppable. I mean, he was invaluable to them, and I hope they told him how much they valued him, but I bet they didn't.
No, almost certainly not. No,
we keep talking about his understanding of the zeitgeist, and I'd like to dig into that a little bit more in terms of kind of what you mean by that, really, because we talk about Nigel Neal a lot. Kev, we had a lovely conversation when we were talking about Quatermass and the Pit about Nigel Neal, and you said that you're still not convinced that he wasn't a time traveller. Right, because there's that incredible line in Quatermass and the Pit when they're talking about, what would you do if your world was having a crisis, a big sort of climate crisis.
Ecological crisis.
Exactly. Well, you'd ignore it and you'd just get on with it and you wouldn't do anything about it and the world would crumble. And this incredible kind of foresight that Neil had. That doesn't strike me that it's necessarily what Jimmy Sangster had as a gift. It wasn't necessarily that he was looking forward. He really seemed to understand what was happening, as you say, the zeitgeist, what is happening now. Was that an understanding of the audience? Was it an understanding of the film industry? Was it an understanding of sort of the world at large? Was it all of those things? Marcus, can you sort of give a bit more insight about what that zeitgeist understanding from him was? The
legendary BBC executive Sidney Newman, who was the guy who created the Avengers and who was one of the people that created Doctor Who and someone that Jimmy worked for in the late 1950s at ITV. He apparently had a sign on the wall behind his desk. When people go to Sidney Newman's office, they would see a sign on the wall behind him, which said, "Don't look back in anger, look around in awareness." And
I like that.
I think that's what Jimmy was doing. So in the mid-1950s, I mean, we don't know. One of the questions I would have loved to have asked Jimmy was, did you go to the Royal Court to see Look Back in Anger? I mean, were you aware of what was changing in what we now call kitchen sink drama? Because its effect, that whole movement's effect on Curse of Frankenstein seems to be profound in hindsight, because, I mean, Universal, I mean, as we all know, I'm sure everyone listening to this knows that it's completely incorrect to describe the Hammer films as remakes of the Universal films. They're just not. They're very, very different. And one of the big changes between Hammer's Frankenstein and Universal's Frankenstein is that Hammer's Frankenstein is actually about Frankenstein himself. It's not really about the creature or the monster. It's actually, the emphasis is shifted towards Frankenstein, which came from Jimmy. And then the Frankenstein himself becomes a baron, this awful, entitled aristocrat, who, much like the hero or anti-hero in Room to Let, just seems to think he's entitled to behave in whatever way he wants and won't let anything get in his way at all. Again, which comes from Jimmy. And so he reinvents Frankenstein, I think, in a way that certainly complies with the kitchen sink movement, the kitchen sink dramas of the time, in a way that audiences would have recognized as being comparable to the characters in dramas such as Look Back in Anger or Room at the Top, etc.
God, Room at the Top. Ugh.
Well, exactly, yeah, exactly. And those characters behave in quite shocking ways now, and certainly through the eyes of modern audiences, but I think that in the 1950s, people found that quite novel, quite exciting. And Jimmy was able to take those ideas and actually incorporate them into Hammer's Gothic horrors. And that's a very, very important thing. It sends the message that the Hammer horrors are not going to be monster movies. Hammer films are not about monsters. I mean, there are some monsters in Hammer films. There's a werewolf film, there's the reptile and things like that. But generally speaking, they're about bad people.
Absolutely right.
Really bad people. And the moral ambiguity which is present in things like Look Back in Anger, and especially in things like Room at the Top, is there in Frankenstein. Because Frankenstein, the Baron, as Jimmy has renamed him, is a very bad man.
Yes.
And yet somehow, with every film, especially in Revenge of Frankenstein, you're really pleased when he gets away with it.
Yeah.
You're really pleased when he gets away with it. And Revenge of Frankenstein is perhaps the ultimate example of that, when Jimmy checks out of the Frankenstein franchise effectively with Revenge of Frankenstein. Because in Revenge of Frankenstein, this is the film where he actually perfects the brain transplant.
Yeah.
Even though it goes on for film after film after film, apparently trying, he actually cracks it in Revenge of Frankenstein. And then at the end of it, and I'm sure everyone's seen it, at the end of it, he opens up a new surgery in Harley Street.
Amazing. Yes. He's got all those women waiting for him.
Women queuing up. I know. What a gift. What a fantastic gift that Jimmy left them with. They could have gone anywhere with that.
I know.
But they don't. They don't. Because for whatever reason, they just wind the clock back and then they do Evil of Frankenstein, which is the most universal influence of all of them, really. And it's just terrible, really, because Jimmy gave them something fantastic there. They could have made something really funny, really nasty as well, you know. And they could have done something with that moral ambiguity. So I think the moral ambiguity comes from the zeitgeist of the period, I think. And so he reinvents Frankenstein in a radical way. He reinvents Dracula. On so many levels, he makes it about sex for the first time. Nobody's done that before, and he effectively makes it about Van Helsing. I mean, the film is called Dracula, but it really should have been called Van Helsing, because Peter Cushing is the star, not Christopher Lee. And we see a lot more of Peter Cushing than we do of Lee.
Marcus, both of those films, Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula, and what you're saying there about Curse of Frankenstein being much more about the Baron, Dracula being much more about Van Helsing. What was the relationship between Jimmy Sangster and Peter Cushing?
Well, I did ask Jimmy this, actually, because there are lots of stories about, there are lots of fan legends, maybe you can confirm this, Kev, that Peter Cushing did not like Jimmy's dialogue.
Apparently so, yeah.
I did ask Jimmy about this. He had no knowledge of this at all. And this apparently came to a head with The Brides of Dracula, which, some people consider to be the greatest of all the Hammer horrors. Is certainly the quintessential Hammer horror. I love it.
I love it.
But there were problems with Jimmy Sangster's draft, and it was rewritten by a bunch of people, 3 or 4 people, including Peter Cushing's friend, Edward Percy, I think it was, Kev?
Yeah.
Who wrote a draft of it, apparently to appease Cushing. No, I just don't know the truth of this, really. I don't know. I mean, I don't see any problems with Jimmy's dialogue. I mean, there were problems within his scripts for the Gothic horrors, but I don't think that odd or awkward dialogue was one of them. The big problem that Jimmy himself identified was that he wasn't very good at writing roles for women.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was something that, I think Revenge of Frankenstein, as much as we admire it, really does that. There's very little for Eunice Gayson to do, except, as one critic said, to sort of swan around handing out soap, I think, to patients. But, by 1959, by 58, 59, Jimmy recognised this himself, and he recognised it as a shortcoming within his own scripts. And, my God, did he address that? Because he spends the rest of his career writing films about women and, putting women at the forefront, making them the protagonists of his stories.
I must say, if that is true, and he did recognise it himself, as a woman who is quite keenly tuned into the absolute tosh that is written to come out of female characters' mouths on screen, it's admirable, I would say, as a male screenwriter, that he did recognise that, and not only recognise it, but overtly and consciously do something about it. I think it's amazing, to be honest.
You can't say that there is a shortage of strong and powerful female protagonists in films like Taste of Fear.
Yep.
Or, The Nanny.
The Nanny.
Oh, God.
Oh, yes.
The Anniversary.
Yep.
We could go on, but Taste of Fear really fixes all of that in one fell swoop and provides a template for just about, for so many of the films that are to follow in Jimmy's career and that Hammer are going to make.
I was going to say, he kept that going right through his Hollywood career as well, didn't he?
He did, yeah, he did. Because the thing about this documentary is that it's called Hammer and Beyond, the Jimmy Sangster Legacy, but it's not really a documentary about Hammer.
Sure.
It's a documentary about Jimmy, because it talks about his career in the 1950s. We discuss productions such as I Can Destroy the Sun, which he did for Armchair Theatre in 1958. And at the other end, after Hammer, the post-Hammer period, we talk about films such as Taste of Evil and Scream Pretty Peggy and Kolchak the Night Stalker, because, again, there is this sort of this narrative has somehow emerged that Jimmy's career in horror filmmaking, or at least with suspense thrillers, came to an end with Fear in the Night. But this wasn't the case at all. He continued making these films, just not for Hammer.
Along those lines, Marcus and Kev, actually, I'd like this from both of you, please. Any deep cuts that you would recommend beyond Sangster's Hammer work, or not even deep cuts, but if you were to recommend films or TV plays, etc., beyond Hammer that our listeners should seek out, what would you recommend?
Some of it's hard to see, because some of the 1950s material doesn't exist anymore, sadly. There's definitely for television, but I have seen I Can Destroy the Sun, which is the play I mentioned earlier, which he made for Armchair Theatre in 1958, and that really is quite something. I think there is a poor quality version on YouTube. I saw it at the BFI many years ago, and that's 1958. That stars Maurice Denham and John Robinson. That's very good. At the other end, as I said, in the 70s, there is Taste of Evil, which is an American TV movie. It was made in 1971, and that combines elements of Taste of Fear and Nightmare. There is his third Betty Davis collaboration. After The Nanny, after The Anniversary, which are both Hammer productions. After that, he made a film called Scream Pretty Peggy in 1973. That's worth watching, especially if you're a fan of Psycho. And I think what is probably, in my view, the single best episode of Kolchak, The Night Stalker, which is called Horror in the Heights, which he made in 1974. That's also excellent, but I'm sure Kev's got his own choices.
Well, I Can Destroy the Sun. I would definitely put in a second vote for that. I think it's an extraordinary piece of work. One of his later films that I actually quite like, and a lot of people don't, but I kind of enjoy it, is The Legacy.
Yes.
Which is a kind of home counties Satanist cult type movie. It'd be right up your street, Becky, I think.
Yeah, that is right up my street.
Well, if you get the Blu-ray, some chap called Lyons does a really good commentary on it. I think you'd learn a lot.
I'll
from
avoid
that.
I'll avoid that. Doesn't sound like my sort of thing at all.
I think you've heard quite enough from him. But no, I think The Legacy, I think it's a really good film, actually. I think it's much better than it was ever given credit for. But I Can Destroy the Sun is amazing. Really.
And what's
good.
that about? Sorry.
It's more science fiction than horror, isn't it?
It is. It's about someone who basically blackmails government because by saying he actually has the power, just by the power of thought, the power of his mind, to actually destroy the sun.
Oh, so that's not a metaphorical title.
Oh, no. He's threatening to do it.
No. And all the time when you're watching it, you think, do you?
Yeah.
Really? Over the course of this thing. And I won't spoil the ending, but it's a very interesting thing. Again, very carefully tailored towards the sort of facilities that filmmakers like Sidney Newman, producers such as Leonard White at Armchair Theatre had at the time. Performed live on a limited number of sets. And Jimmy was able to pivot to that sort of thing very, very easily because he knew how to write on a budget. So he was a great fit for the live television of that era. And as we point out in the documentary, his television career begins, I think, just weeks or months after Curse of Frankenstein has been released. He's already diversifying. He's only written one Hammer horror.
Yeah.
But he's already trying to turn himself into a different kind of writer.
Yeah.
Already. He's looking at, as Alan Barnes points out in the documentary, he's looking at a complete career. He's very happy at that stage to be the Hammer horror guy, very happy to be working alongside his friends Anthony Hines and Michael Carreras, but he doesn't want to be typecast.
Sure, yeah.
He wants a career. And, he's the guy at Hammer that gets that career. He's the only guy, really, from that group who's able to make the transition to a career in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
That's very true, yeah.
A career at the Hollywood studios, because the other guys don't, which again, as I keep saying, is nothing against those guys. But Jimmy wants more, and he actually has the talent and the ability to do that.
We're going to start wrapping things up. Marcus, I want to come on to just talk about a couple of plugs from you. But before we do that, any kind of final thoughts, Kev, Marcus, I'll come on to you in a sec, about just Jimmy Sangster? Is there anything that you haven't had the chance to say about him and his work that you sort of want listeners to take away from this chat?
Not really. I just want to reiterate, and Marcus has made this point as well, just how important he was to Hammer. Hammer would have been very, very, very different had they not got Jimmy Sangster working for them. If they'd not got him there on the set as a production manager and was just on site and they were able to say, well, go and write X the Unknown then, or whatever he was going to call it at the time, I think Hammer would have been a very, very different proposition and almost certainly wouldn't have lasted quite as long as they did. I think he was that important to them. And that, by extension, that important to the history of the horror movie.
I mean, that is it, isn't it? I mean, that the sort of knock-on effect of his effect on Hammer is still sort of echoing through the ages almost.
It's enormous.
Yeah.
It's enormous, the effect he had, yeah.
Marcus, was there anything that you learned while you were making the documentary? Obviously, you knew the man very well. You've been sort of saturated in his work for so many years. But was there anything that you kind of came out of the end when you sort of submitted it, it's ready, that you thought, wow, I didn't know that or I didn't think about that before?
Well, I think the problem was that I wasn't as saturated in his work as I should have been. And I think that the process of making this documentary taught me an awful lot about how much else he did. I think if people come away from watching the documentary with just one thing, I'd like it to be the fact that Hammer needed Jimmy more than Jimmy needed Hammer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very grateful that Severin have given all of us this opportunity to make this program, because I think that, as far as I'm aware, this is the first time there's ever been a box set of Hammer films that's actually been named after one of the people that actually created them.
Wow.
Yes, that's a good point.
I don't think there's never been an Anthony Hines box set. No. There's never even been a Terence Fisher box set.
There should be a Barbara Shelley box set.
There should be a Barbara Shelley box set. Absolutely, yes, absolutely there should. The first lady of Hammer.
Yes.
My absolute new obsession, Barbara Shelley.
Yeah, and so I mean, the box set is called Sangster Directs Hammer. I think it's long overdue recognition, I think.
So, Marcus, your documentary, Hammer and the Beyond, the Jimmy Sangster Legacy, obviously, as we keep saying, it's part of the beautiful box set from Severin. Is there going to be an opportunity for people to see it if you don't buy the box set?
I don't know. I would like to think so. I would like to think it gets some screening somewhere. That would be a question for Severin. But that would be wonderful if that did happen.
I wonder if, Kev, maybe we should have a chat to producer Mike and see if we can screen the documentary followed by one of our favourite Jimmy Sangster films.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah?
Yes, please.
Marcus, maybe you'd come and join us on stage for that.
Oh, that would be a wonderful thing, wouldn't it?
That would be amazing.
Oh my God.
A whole evening celebrating Jimmy Sangster. I mean, come on.
My God.
What's not to love? What's not to
I have literally just thought that up on the spot, so now that's my mission to make that happen.
Superb thinking. I like it.
Make it happen.
Make it happen. Quite right.
The other thing, Marcus, is you mentioned right at the top of this chat that you wrote the book The Hammer Story, and you've got a new edition. Is it out? Is it due out?
Well, the third edition of the last edition of The Hammer Story was in 2007, and a third edition. Alan Barnes and I have written a third edition of the book, which is the most radical update and expansion of the book that there's ever been.
Wow.
A complete redesign from top to bottom. It is in many respects a completely different book, I think. And I think that, certainly from my point of view, it's the book I always wanted it to be.
Oh, I love that.
It took 30 years, but we got there in the end. And that's being published by Titan on the 15th of September.
Lovely.
And then after that, in October, I'm curating a new exhibition, which is going to include a lot of Hammer, which is going to open in Peterborough. And that's going to run from October through to the early part of the new year.
Amazing. What's the title of the exhibition?
Well, it's early days yet. It's early days. And so it's not been officially announced yet. But it will open at the end of October.
Fantastic. Oh my God, how exciting. Well, I cannot wait to get my hands on a copy of your book. I don't have either of the previous editions, so I'm going to go in straight in on edition 3, the one that you always wanted to make. I can't wait to see it. Marcus, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such a fun and fascinating chat. Kev, thank you so much for all of your fascinating insight as always. We'll wrap it up here, but Marcus Hearn, thanks so much for joining us on Hammer Time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Hammer Time. Next week, normal service will resume and we will be discussing the occult classic The Devil Rides Out from 1968. If you're watching along, you can rent it on Prime, Apple TV, Studio Canal Presents and the BFI player, and it's available on DVD and Blu-ray, so you've got no excuses. To check out the full list of movies we'll be covering throughout the podcast, head to evolutionofhorror.com/hammer. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us questions or comments for upcoming mailbag episodes. Drop us an email to hammer@evolutionofhorror.com. You can follow the Evolution of Horror Network on Instagram at EOH_network and on BlueSky at Evolution of Horror. You can follow me on Instagram and BlueSky at Bunny Darke, and on Letterboxd I'm Becky Darke. And Kev, where can people find you and your work?
You can find me as EOFF-TV, Encyclopedia of Fantastic Film and Television. I've said this before, I'll say it again. If in 2001, when I came up with that, I realised I was going to have to say it quite so many times, I'd have chosen something snappier. EOFF-TV, I'm on BlueSky, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Letterboxd. And you can find my website, Encyclopedia of Fantastic Film and Television, as EOFFTV.com, or search EOFF-TV Review for the sister review site.
Don't forget to rate and review us on your podcast app of choice. Thank you for listening. Join us again next week for another episode of Hammer Time.